Welcome back to Luxe Consumer IQ and part 2 of our Data and Insight Foundational series. In part 1, the last episode, we talked about data as currency, the evidence that sits behind desire. Today, we take the next step, how you turn that evidence into meaning and meaning into action. This episode is not a lecture on why insights matter. You already know that. This is about the practice of insight inside premium and luxury. Where it comes from, how to interpret it, and how to turn it into a story people can act on. Because insight in any industry isn't the research or data itself, it's the meaning you extract from it. Whether you sit in marketing, retail, CRM, innovation, or you're just starting out, completely new, this episode gives you a simple, usable structure to bring clarity into your work. Let's begin. So where does insight actually live within a luxury business? In highly disciplined categories like FMCG, the pipeline is crystal clear. From research and data to insight to strategy and execution. Clean, linear and predictable. It's one of the reasons FMCG has produced some of the world's best marketers. The discipline is extraordinary. But if you're in luxury, you'll know it doesn't look like that here. Luxury relies on intuition, cultural reading, craft, emotion, and decades of observation, with organised insight often scarce and scattered across the organisation. A little sits with brand teams, a little in CRM, a lot in retail, some with agencies, some in leadership's heads, some in brand tracking, some in macro trend reports, and some in conversations you didn't even know counted as insight at the time. It's important to establish that it's normal and that insight is rarely born in one place. Your job is to simply pull it together from across the organisation and to make sense of it. But it's not as complicated as you think, because usually you have access. You probably have always had access, but before you didn't know what you were looking for. That's why you're here. So what type of insight do you actually need? To make this a little easier, let's first start with a simple way to look at what insight actually includes. Think of consumer insight as 5 connected layers of intelligence. They move from what's closest to the individual consumer, their actual behaviour, and out to the wider landscape that shapes them. So what are these 5 layers? Well, the first is behavioural insight. This is what people actually do. Think buying, switching, loyalty, usage, frequency, formats, channel choice, and so on. The second is shopper and experience insight. This is how people buy and experience the category or your product. Think online versus in-store. Think touch points, browsing and engagement patterns, triggers and barriers, and decision flow. One example under shopper insights could be the way a consumer navigates a store, from when they first walk in to when they leave. Where did they go first? What did they touch? This is one of my favourite topics. And in episode 4, we cover the importance of this type of research with Oksana, our wholesale luxury expert. The third is cultural insight, what's shifting around them and what's influencing those behaviours. Think aesthetics, symbols, language, identity, rituals, aspirations. Our conversation in episode 2 with Dr. Maman Lorifi explains this in more detail. I encourage you to listen. She's incredibly clever and has been doing this for a long time. Fourth is category and market insight. This is what happens in the wider landscape and one I'm more familiar with in my most recent roles. Think growth segments, regional patterns, category trends, seasonality, price trends, and so on. Think macro trends. Fifth is brand insight, what people really think and feel about your brand. Think codes, associations, distinctiveness, relevance, salience, and luxury's favourite, desirability, the elusive one. These layers don't compete, they connect. They form the full picture of the consumer and the brand. And just to reassure you, these aren't categories specific to one business or category. They're the standard intelligence layers used across sectors. You'll see versions of them everywhere. McKinsey, Bain, Kantar, Euromonitor, the global heavyweights in consumer and market insight. So no matter who your organisation is affiliated with, these work. Every company labels them slightly differently, but the principles are always the same. Now, here's the part that most people miss. Insight isn't the data point itself. That's a fact or statistic. Insight is the meaning you uncover when you connect the dots, sometimes across multiple layers and sometimes deep within a single one, depending on the question you're trying to answer. Which brings us to the framework. How do you get to a clear action from this insight? This is where a lot of marketers want to give up. Yes, it's overwhelming. You are so busy, probably doing the work of two, and you don't have time. But I've been there. Let me tell you, it doesn't have to be difficult. You just need to stay single-minded and follow the formula. And the reality is, if you are already pulling together complex marketing plans, you can do this. You just have to start somewhere. Okay, so what's the formula? To make this simple, here's a quick overview of a structure I use. It's 5 steps, and I'll explain them in turn. And depending on where you work and the culture and the expectations from leadership, there will be things you may already do. Step 1. Frame the problem. Data is like asking, how long is a piece of string? You need to have a very specific problem you need to solve or want to understand. Step 2. Collect the evidence. What can you observe, count, track, or reliably capture? If you don't have what you need, depending on the size of the opportunity, you may need to buy something new, be it research or a key industry report. Step 3. The insight, the meaning, the aha moment. The tension, truth, or shift behind the evidence. This is what you're looking for, the hidden driver that explains the pattern. Step 4 is the story, the fun part, where luxury teams always excel. It's the narrative, the way you deliver and explain the insight so people can understand it and buy into your plan. Step 5 is the action, the design, the shift, the move the brand makes because the insight is clear. Together, these steps take you from raw observation to real influence. Let's take an example. So if we said data is the what, insight is the why, a data point on its own is meaningless. For example, searches are up 20%. Traffic dropped on mobile. A format is selling out. These are all symptoms or stats. They are not insight. Insight emerges when you connect them to one of the 5 layers: behavior, shopper, culture, category, or brand. And then ask the question, what does this really mean for the consumer? Not what do they want, not what did they tell you, but what is the hidden driver underneath? That's the shift premium and luxury brands thrive on. If you think back to the example with film and magazines in part 1, we talked about how magazines and movies live and die by understanding human drivers, emotion, identity, aspiration. Well, luxury moves on the same human drivers. That's why insight matters so much. Now let's take a closer look at the other critical step for luxury. Step 4, storytelling. This is something the best leaders do exceptionally well. They turn the insight into a story because stories influence decisions far better than spreadsheets. BCG calls it the insight to impact translation. And it's exactly what separates strategic thinkers from those who just execute. A strong insight story has 3 parts. 1, context, what's happening around the consumer. 2, tension, what's changing or what doesn't make sense yet. 3, meaning, the shift the brand needs to recognize. When you tell a story well, the decision becomes obvious, and inside luxury houses, this clarity really matters. Because when your teams understand the core meaning behind the data, the story, they make better, more consistent decisions across the brand. Luxury insiders are master storytellers, in fact, more so than in other industries, so you already know this. You also know that if your storytelling is off, the room is, well, uninterested, bored. Once the story is clear, the action becomes simple. This is where insight becomes impact. So actions could be a shift in positioning, a refinement of brand codes, a packaging decision, a hero SKU strategy, a retail experience change, an investment choice, a communication angle, or simply saying no to something that doesn't fit the brand DNA. Here's what this looks like in practice. Let's take an example focused on the retail environment. Premium and luxury brands spend enormous amounts of energy crafting in-store experiences. The lighting, materials, music, scent, spatial flow, it's all designed to signal prestige and create a sensory experience. But how do you know if it's working? One way could be via shopper research. I told you it's one of my favorites. These could be observational studies, so this is watching how people move through the space, post-visit interviews, understanding what they noticed, what they felt, what influenced their decision, journey mapping, identifying the moments that matter most. We loved this one at LVMH. Now, let's apply it to a problem. The problem is that store conversion is low. You have data showing that the in-store traffic is strong, but conversion is lower than expected. So that's the symptom. We are not converting as expected. The insight comes when you dig into the experience. Perhaps customers feel intimidated by staff. Perhaps it's a big ticket item and staff are not trained to talk to the product well and evoke an emotional response. Perhaps the space signals exclusivity so strongly that it creates a barrier to entry. Perhaps the product is beautifully displayed, but not inviting to touch or explore. Perhaps the checkout experience breaks the brand spell. The story in this case becomes, we've designed an experience that signals prestige beautifully, but it's not engaging our consumer and the final moment of decision. Something is not delivering to their expectations about this experience. And the action? Subtle shifts in service training, spatial layout, product accessibility, or closing rituals, all designed to maintain prestige while lowering the emotional barrier to purchase. This kind of work is foundational in luxury retail. As Dr. Maman Lorifi said in episode 2, your staff are the living expression of the brand codes, so if the human experience is off, the whole meaning collapses. And Oksana in episode 4, our global luxury wholesale expert, told us the retail store is like a mini research lab, because that is where the consumer interacts with your brand. There is just so much to learn there. And it's exactly the kind of insight that sits at the intersection of behavior, brand, and shopper experience. So if you're wondering where to actually start with all of this, because this is where people often get overwhelmed, what data do you really need? Here's the truth. You will never have everything. Not even the giants do. When I worked at the world's biggest luxury groups, and these are companies that can afford almost any data set on the planet, there was always something missing. A panel we didn't subscribe to, a report we hadn't bought, a segment we hadn't studied yet, a behavior that suddenly needed deeper understanding. Insights and data are like a piece of string. You can keep pulling forever. So here's your anchor. You only need the right intelligence for the decision in front of you. Start with the question or the problem. What is the decision my business and I are trying to make about the brand? And what clarity do we need to make it well? And depending on that question, the insight you need might sit at one or more of the 5 layers, be it market, consumer, or cultural intelligence. What you need to remember is once you know what you're looking for, the task becomes far more manageable and way less overwhelming, because any other type of insight at this stage is just a nice to have, because it won't help you with the problem at hand. Now, don't get me wrong, long-term insight programs do exist. They coexist and are just as important, like continuous brand health tracking, for example, run all year round or annually, depending on your size, market activity, and of course, budget. These are the critical pulse checks for legacy luxury brands, and we love doing those, often. But what I'm talking about here today is much more immediate, finding the specific insight that helps you understand your consumers better and over-deliver on the experience so that you are always driving desirability. So here's the takeaway from today's episode. Insight is not about knowing everything. It's about seeing what matters clearly, early, and through the right lens. It's rarely about more data. It's about sharper discernment, and that's what this framework gives you. The framework, again, is what's the problem, find the data, extract the insight, build the story, and deliver the action. 5 steps that bring the structure to an industry that thrives on creativity and emotion. Next episode, we'll be shifting into luxury automotive. I'll be speaking with a marketing director behind one of Europe's most recognizable luxury car brands about how they use insight and performance data together in the real world, in market, and with real results. You won't want to miss this one. I'll see you there.